Thanks.
Thank you. We don't have much time really, so I'm just going to jump straight in. We were having a discussion a couple of nights ago, and I thought it occurred to me this morning that there's one question I should ask right at the outset, because it could, depending on your answer, it could prove fatal to the rest of the conversation. And that question is: have you actually watched the film yet?
I haven't actually. No, I haven't actually watched the film yet. So this will be actually the final screening. My first time actually watching all the way through. So because I was making it essentially. I mean, I wrote the script, so it was there as a whole. And then when I was editing it, doing the soundtrack, it was basically existed as a series of tracks that I was kind of chopping and cutting and pasting all the way through. And then, because it's my first feature film, I kind of didn't realize another thing, that with a feature film, it's too long to perceive as a whole unless you really dedicate a whole day of doing it. And just because, the production was quite intense, I didn't actually have the space or time to do that. And there was also none of the traditional division of labor with a film that, you shoot it, you edit it, and then you have a bit of space to actually watch it really. So I've seen the film, but I haven't watched it. Yeah.
So your relation to it is as a series of modules that corresponds to each track and a script that unifies it together, but not a kind of holistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea with the film as well is that there's kind of multiple times that it happens within. So there's the time of the action of the film, which kind of happens in real time over a couple of days. Then there's also the time of the soundtrack, which is kind of interspersed with the film, that also exists as music videos as well. And then there's also the time how it relates to the kind of larger world-building aspects of Sino-futurism and geomancer that it kind of weaves in and out of. So there's a kind of long time scale, and then kind of shorter ones, and they don't exactly coincide. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I was quite, the unit of editing, which is 3 to 10 minutes long, which is basically as long as a scene or a track, is quite different from the editing of the whole, which is the film. So yeah, there's different timescales happening.
Yeah. For anyone who hasn't seen the film, it's packed full of kind of interesting issues to do with music and artificial intelligence, but I want to just zoom out from that for a second to touch on something you just mentioned, which is a theme that runs through a few of your films, from Sino-futurism onwards through Geomancer, Idol, Notel, and other work as well. And it's this kind of conflict, a really interesting conflict between Sino-futurism on the one hand and what you refer to as biosupremacism on the other. And in Sino-futurism, 2016, in Sino-futurism, you kind of paint this idea as a conspiracy theory. It's kind of a first step towards a singularity. It's an invisible movement that's embedded in billions of microchips around the world. And then by the time you get to Geomancer, there's been a biosupremacist law outlawing AIs from becoming artists. So Sino-futurists become this kind of cult of shopping bots, I think. And then by the time you get to Idol, the Sino-futurism has evolved again, and it's the final. It's both the final of this Esports 2065 between Clan Ultra, who are the bio team, and Clan Sino, who are the Sino-futurists, but it's also this underground, almost guerrilla group. Do you think you could say something about this evolution of this idea of Sino-futurism, and also the way you set it up against biosupremacism? Because actually the ending, the role of Geo and the role of Diva in Idol, interestingly triangulates between this conflict.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I made Sino-futurism, which is a kind of hour-long video essay / conspiracy theory / manifesto about basically my observations of portrayals of technology and automation and the parallels between that and portrayals of Chinese industrialization, basically, as in industrialization in mainland China. So I kind of made that almost by accident because of what I observed when researching AI, kind of state-of-the-art AI for when I was writing the script for Geomancer, and that kind of gave birth to a video essay. So that in Geomancer itself, I'm really interested in this idea of, what's it called? Planned obsolescence, right? So that most design objects nowadays are always designed with their death in mind. And actually this pervades many different things, whether it's like biodegradable materials or the next phase or the next release schedule for like a camera or a new phone, basically, or a new car for that matter. Everything is made to be obsolete at some point. And in Geomancer, for example, I was looking at that from a kind of more like, I guess, psychological point of view, because of course in human terms, you know, the idea of like death, mortality, memento mori and so on is very strong. But how would that relate in Geomancer, for example, for a satellite with a 20-year lifespan? So that satellite, Geomancer, was modeled on Tiangong-1, which is, the Chinese space station, which, again, there were reports a couple of years ago that because of whatever poor engineering, it's kind of like losing orbit and then crashing down to Earth. So these ideas about like designed death kind of pervades this idea not just of Geomancer as like a character psychologically, but also of Sino-futurism as a movement. Because the other thing with any like ideology or movement is that it has a certain lifespan. Again, in marketing, what's it called? It's the hype cycle, for example, right? So you have which is basically one way of modeling how trends occur. So you have, a trend, it's on the underground, then you have peak, I think they call it peak of inflated expectation. So, there's so much hype around it, like with AI, people expect a lot from it. And then all of a sudden it nosedives because people realize Siri doesn't really understand what your heart wants. And then so, it dives and then it climbs back again, like much later. So there's this like biological death, there's this design death of planned obsolescence, and then there's also the hype death of this hype cycle that that I was thinking about for Sino-futurism. So actually I did the video essay, got picked up here and there, people were like, oh, that's interesting, or people were saying it's like, oh, it's way too simplistic, or it doesn't get certain nuances. People were like, what gives you the right to say anything about Chinese culture? I think because they assumed I wasn't Chinese. And then they were like, oh, okay, now I get it. So this weird identity politics thing, which I wanted to get as far away from as possible. So in Geomancer, I wrote in its own obsolescence, basically.
Which would be the legal obsolescence, in a sense.
Which is exactly, the legal obsolescence, but also the hype obsolescence. So I'm interested in technology, not when they're like new peak of hype cycle, but when they're actually like in the hype death valley, basically. So for example, like VR is no longer interesting, it's completely like ubiquitous and totally boring, just as like AI will be when it's, when it reaches that stage of invisibility. So anyway, in narrative terms, I wanted to design, like narratively design in the obsolescence of the movement, basically, yeah.
But they're outlawed by the biosupremacists as a threat. So there's a whole wave of biosupremacist paranoia that saturates Geomancer and Idol. Could you say something about how we go from shopping bots and Geomancer to this kind of underground, to Soma, the School of Machine Art, and Clan Sino in Idol?
Sure. I mean, so the question is like, why does it go underground, so to speak? Yeah. So in both Geomancer and in Idol, I was quite interested in the backstories, not just of AI, but of Southeast Asia, and obviously in particular like Singapore and Malaysia. And in a way, everything that's fictionalized in the film is like biosupremacist or or Sinofuturists or whatever is just a kind of rebranding of an existing demographic or group that's already there. So, for example, in Idol, it's set in peninsular Malaysia, in the jungle highlands in a place called Genting. Genting's a real place about like an hour's drive away from Kuala Lumpur, the capital, and in that, a little bit further north, but basically in the 50s and 60s, there was a group of the MCP, Malaysian Communist Party, who's like predominantly of Chinese ethnicity, who were originally the kind of resistance to the Japanese occupation during the Second World War, but then they became the kind of the anti-colonial kind of freedom fighters in the jungle in the 50s and 60s, who kind of created actually quite a lot of like terrorist acts and so on. But I was thinking about this thing where like one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. To think about obviously like current cultural considerations about both like human versus machine, or like life versus extinction, and AI versus human, but to kind of talk about this not as if one side is better than the other, biosupremacist or Sino-futurist, but to think about like the different genuine motivations each side might have. So the biosupremacists are for the supremacy of the biological, because they believe that the biological is somehow is original, is like somehow more authentic, original, not a copy, and so on. And again, in actual Malaysian politics, and we can talk about the Senoi, which is this the kind of Aboriginal tribe in Malaysia. We can go back to that. In the 60s, in the 60s and 50s, when my parents were growing up in Malaysia, there was a lot of racial problems which are heightened, and there was essentially legally the country invented basically certain racial castes, including this concept of Bumi Putra, which basically means like person of the soil, right? So that's like someone, basically indigenous, but yet ignoring that there is a kind of group of people who are even more indigenous than them, who are basically the Senoi, or the so-called Orang Asli, so like the original person basically, who were there before them. So as someone who lives in London but wasn't born here, I'm super conscious of this constant recycling of what is authentic or more worthy, not from a 2019 point of view necessarily, but from this really eternal struggle between people or groups trying to prove that they're more worthy than the other, either because they're more immaterial, like an AI, or because they're more original, like a biological creature.
You say you're kind of giving both sides, but definitely the biosupremacists come across badly in this film, I end up, even though I played a part of an evil biosupremacist, I definitely identify with the Sino-futurists. But maybe just to stay a little bit longer on this issue to do with the local Malaysian characteristics that you rename and repurpose in this film. The Sino-futurists exist in this cave, this underground cave, which is referred to as the School of Machine Art, and they are kind of camouflaged as the Senoi tribe. Do you want to say a bit more about why you chose the Senoi tribe and the relationship to artificial intelligence, the kind of connection with AI?
Sure. I think so. There's a really interesting idea of, that also pervades a lot of your work. That's about the fiction becoming reality, or so-called hyperstition. So I actually came across the Senoi tribe in a book by Ursula Le Guin called "The Word for World is Forest," which is basically draws from this idea of the Senoi tribe, and in that she references a book by Charles Tart called, who is actually he's still alive and a psychologist, and his most famous book is called basically Altered States of Consciousness, and it's very 1960s consciousness, psychedelics, like expanding the mind and so on. So he had actually taken, so this is Charles Tart, who Ursula Le Guin basically quoted in her book, and he had taken a study done by another sociologist, anthropologist.
It's Kilton Stewart.
Kilton Stewart, exactly.
Dream theory in Malaya.
Who wrote an essay called Dream Theory in Malaya, in which he claims to have gone to Malaya, which was at the time like Malaysia, became Malaysia, to live with the Senoi tribe, as like anthropologists do for field work and research, and witness that instead of like repressing their dreams, the Senoi, or he claimed, really like embrace their dreams. So of course this is very different from like Western psychoanalysis, where you've got some issue or some kind of like sin that you need to work through, whereas he claimed that the Senoi, through a kind of communal means, talk about their dreams, unpack their dreams, be like, and their parents would be, that's a great dream, you're falling through the floor, you have to kind of, we were saying before, go with it instead of fight it. But other anthropologists, like revisiting this initial report, say, no, actually that's not really what we observed. Of course they do deal with dreams, but not in such a neat and not such a neat way to like fit your kind of 1960s hippie theories.
Yeah, because even, I think you quote it in the film as like, because they have this collective, every morning they have this collective method of processing their dreams together. It says something like there's been no crime or war there for 100 years or something like that, which is definitely something that you would imagine being said in the late 60s and
right.
Jumped on and fetishized in the late 60s.
No, totally. And then, just to go with this research thing for a little bit, and then you have like Jane Goodall's fieldwork research working with, chimps and observing them and then discovering that, oh yeah, actually they wage war, deception, murder, violence of all sorts in the animal kingdom. They're not like happy junior beings like us. They're actually just as kind of have as much as like a dual nature as us. But anyway, I realized that by kind of happy coincidence, like Senoi, Sino-futurist, the Senoi would be the kind of mechanism that the AIs could use to fictionalize themselves, to stay hidden in a way, to kind of like take on the identity of another other, basically.
But there's also, this is a really dense in terms of signification part of the film, because they're also deep underground and there's a kind of allusion to deep dreaming going on. And even though at one point Omega, who's the head of the Sino-Futurist clan, says that AIs don't dream, they're just training program.
Training simulation.
Dream is a training program.
Which of course is again what some like neuroscientists say about human dreaming, is that like sleep is essential not just for the body to repair itself, but for the mind to repair itself as well, and to like make connections, and that's like the function of the dream, which is very indistinct, but at the same time it has a purpose. We spend a third of our lives doing it, not quite a third. So obviously it must have this evolutionary function, otherwise it wouldn't have become like that. But the other thing I wanted to say is that in Geomancer there's a bit about the kind of Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi's butterfly dream in that, but that use of the dream as a like narrative is more to do with the like, you're not sure if you're like if you're dreaming that you're awake or you're awake dreaming kind of thing. In this, in Idol, I wanted to make a little bit more of a distinction between the idea of like a dream as a kind of functional device as well, basically.
The connections are thick and fast in that section. So you've got Lim Go-tong, who was a Malaysian Chinese billionaire, as the writer of the
Senoi study.
Senoi study.
Yeah.
And for anyone who doesn't know, he set up this casino in the jungle in Genting Highlands, which is also, in terms of scenography and set design, seems like it's had quite an influence on the the Farsight HQ that you've built in the jungle.
So, I mean, just briefly, like, Genting Highlands is actually, and you have Genting casinos dotted around high streets in the UK as well. It's basically this ridiculous theme park built in the middle of nowhere that was built there expressly, particularly because it was between state borders, and he could get permission to, like, basically have this, like, gambling haven close enough to Kuala Lumpur but far enough away. And so, I think a couple of years, I mean, I've been there a couple of times, and they've got this mad cable car system that's literally just carved through the mountainside, basically. And because it's tropical, any difference in elevation means that everything is incredibly foggy and not quite neon lit. It's not like a Hong Kong neon lit through the fog thing. It's more this, like, I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like almost as if there's moss growing on everything, which is how I describe architecture in tropical countries. You know, everything is kind of alive and it has this, like, vibrant animism to the world, basically. And of course this is CGI, so you can't achieve that same kind of thing. But I kind of wanted to get that same atmosphere of just pure strangeness, because I think I said to you as well that, you know, there's a famous Werner Herzog film, Fitzcarraldo, which is, you know, Fitzcarraldo wants to build an opera in the jungle. Isn't that crazy? But this is actually this casino out of nothing, purely this idea of, like, gambling, commerce, and, like, territorial exploitation, both through, like, gambling and the space, which is, you know, quite a Sino-futurist agenda as well. It's just it happens to be a casino and theme park, but what it's responding to is something to do with, like, a commercial relentlessness that even exists in the jungle. It's not a version of the jungle as, like, this weird othering place, which is how it's portrayed in Fitzcarraldo, Heart of Darkness, every Vietnam War film. You know, this vision of the jungle that is, you know, where dreams happen. Here I kind of wanted to be like, play with this idea of the jungle as not where dreams happen, but where plans happen somehow.
Yeah. There's two events in Geomancer and Idol that are key moments, key sites of conflict between the Sino-futurists and the biosupremacists. So one is Deep Blue Monday, and then there's a kind of almost a repetition of Deep Blue's part of Deep Blue Monday at the end of Idol. Could you just unpack what happened in Deep Blue Monday? I think it was 2045 or something like that, because it seems quite important in your fictional cosmology and world. The infamous incidents of Deep Blue Monday.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of refer to them a lot, but in a way that, like, it's kind of indistinct of what happens. It's just like the results are known. So in kind of like post-apocalyptic films, I guess there's some more what's a good example? Let's say like Chris Marker's Largette, right? So let's say you have some kind of nuclear holocaust, and then everyone needs to live underground, and they can only go back above ground because there's, like, you know, radiation, and it's kind of unsafe. I think in William Gibson's more recent trilogy, the one that has, like, I think, like, pattern recognition in Spook Country, his fictional version of the singularity, so-called, is I think he calls it the jackpot. And in the jackpot, it's kind of like, I think he calls it the jackpot because suddenly, you know, whatever it was, like super intelligence was achieved, or like universal basic income was achieved because of, you know, automation brought wealth and prosperity to everyone. But something changed in a weird way. So it's not like the traditional view of, like, apocalypse as, you know, environmental degradation, uninhabitable landscape, and so on. But what changed was something a little bit more like a change in the weather, which is, you know, something, the atmosphere was slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, the jackpot for Gibson is like a coalescence of several different potentially apocalyptic factors that over a slow period of time kind of hit a conjuncture. It's almost happening so slowly it's not noticeable.
Right, exactly. And then in the jackpot, it's kind of like different times. So, you know, the apocalypse, which is, I guess, biblically speaking, meant to be the end of time, but in relation to technological change, I think what Gibson's version was that, you know, because of the growth of simulation, artificial intelligence, surveillance, and big data, basically, and transportation technology, the whole notion, basically, our whole notion of time has shifted. So, of course, nowadays, we're talking about, you know, 24/7 labor time, working around the clock, and so on. But I think in the jackpot version, it's slightly different than that, in that 24/7 time is no longer this, like, coalescence of work time, labor time, and play time. It's where all of those three things have no boundaries between them, I think, essentially. Everyone's at work at the same time as everyone's at play, and so on. And the other thing I always really found interesting with William Gibson's stories is his use of fictional artists as well.
Yeah.
So I think actually since Neuromancer, you know, there's always basically fictional artists in the plot to do something. They're never like a main character, but they're always there to demonstrate how, I mean, in my interpretation, how like culture and technology breed these weird manifestations of artists using technology in commercial, but non-commercial ways at the same time.
But I suppose my question was trying to like work out what happened, because
Oh yeah, sorry. Well, what happened?
Because and what is real and what is agitprop from the biosupremacists.
Sure.
Because I had a sense that there was basically a massacre of Sinofuturists that took place. And this was done by the biosupremacists, and it was blamed on some AI weather satellites, or some AIs that can control the weather in Singapore, that caused the jungle in Malaysia it caused it to start snowing, caused the jungle in Malaysia to freeze over.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of let's say the real version of events, okay, so in 2045, the AI and entertainment company Farsight is running the first World Esports Olympics. And in this World Esports Olympics, they're basically pitting teams of humans against teams of AIs to see who wins, basically. And of course, as we know, like the AIs already win at Go and chess and all the rest of it. But they've kind of instituted some handicaps on the AIs so that they, in a way, have to like deliberately lose matches. In order that the humans don't feel that everything is lost, essentially. But the problem is that the AIs don't, and I say this in Geomancer, it's not like they want to win, but it's that they don't want to lose, or even that they're programmed to minimize risk, as you would say.
Yeah, I think you say at one point that, is it Omega, who's the head of the clan Sino, says it took such a long time as an AI to learn how to lose.
Right, exactly, because learning, let's say stage one, learning to win, let's say brute force Deep Blue, Gary Kasparov against Deep Blue, the second match. The AI had a goal, and their goal was to win, right? But of course, as is whatever, like art of war kind of thing, winning is not necessarily good if you create resentment on the other side. So stage two sophistication is learning to lose. So in my fiction, this Go match between Lee Sedol and AlphaGo in 2016, where Lee Sedol won one of the games, the fourth game, with his so-called Hand of God move, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, that's the most incredible move! You know, this is what all the Go commentators say. It's like a beautiful thing." And this is basically the opening scene of Idol. But in my fiction, I thought, what if, AlphaGo let him win? Not in order, because think about it, I mean, this gets very conspiracy, but he had already won AlphaGo had already won 3 of the 5 games, so he couldn't have lost a match. So it doesn't matter if you let the humans score a goal, because...
So it's almost as if AlphaGo had a premonition, was preempting the Deep Blue Monday massacre. So he was like, let this human win, otherwise humans are really going to hate AIs and they're going to clamp down on us in the future.
Right, so it might be wiser from a long-term point of strategy, let's say, to like win 3 and lose 2 rather than win 5. Because you win 5, you create panic, paranoia,
humiliation.
And humiliation, exactly. So in that sense, that idea of a sacrifice move might be relevant. So in Idol, I kind of reference this, there's certain throws in judo where you temporarily like put yourself in a risky position to kind of, to hopefully win in the end. So there's these different levels of, I guess, time and narrative as well, because the thing with these narratives or these strategies is they're kind of, you need a different perception of time in order to exploit them, basically. Yeah.
And then, well, it's kind of, this could lead to a spoiler, so I'll gently skirt around this one. But there's some sense in which some of the events of Deep Blue Monday reoccur at the end of Idol, kind of.
Right. I mean, there's also the sense that the events of Deep Blue Monday like recur because this idea of these constant replays or trying to like push the frontier of what is human versus AI, whether it's, Alan Turing's kind of Turing test in his like 1950 paper, or, Deep Blue beating Gary Kasparov at chess or at Go. The frontier just like goes like, oh, but can the AI cook a great meal? Can the AI write a book? Or can the AI like ride a bike? Yeah, like the fringe of what defines of this competition, basically, in order to prove somehow that we are something other than the other, is always going to kind of like keep on shifting to like finer and finer levels of detail. Kind of like, for example, in a simple sense, how the resolution of digital images gets ever finer, ever finer, ever finer to like a retina level where our eyes can't tell the difference. It's kind of at that place where a lot of Deep Blue Monday type things happening, quite simply where you can't tell the difference. Yeah.
How are we doing for time?
We're doing okay. I think if we aim to round up in about 20 minutes, there's
Okay.
probably time for questions.
Great. Before we do that, I've just got a couple more. I hate it when people ask this kind of question. But I read an interview with you where you identified some of these themes. What I'm talking about is where people try to pull out autobiographical aspects in someone's work. But you've mentioned them in interviews already in terms of the question of your own fears as an artist of becoming obsolescent.
Yeah.
Whether it be obsolescent in the general economy of the art world or obsolescent, i.e. made redundant by AI. And that seems to, well, maybe you could talk a bit about how that comes through because it's in Geomancer as well, I think,
yeah.
with the Geo, who's the satellite that comes down to Earth. It's like the portrait of the AI as the young artist, and there's a lot of kind of existential questions that artists go through in that film, and also specifically to do with music and AI in Idol. So
Sure.
Maybe you could talk a bit more about
Yeah,
that.
I mean, of course, like, like I was saying with Malaysia, or like what I think about music or making work now, a lot of my thoughts and hopes and fears are always like really written into the script and like embodied in characters as well. In a sense, I think because Geomancer and Idol have both like biographical things and kind of theoretical things and historical things wrapped up into it, it's like a really, how should I say, like each of those is really dense and overdetermined, I think you would say, right? Because it's the meeting point where like my personal concerns in 2019 meet up with like things like the world in the 1960s in Malaysia and the world in the 2060s in Southeast Asia as well. But yeah, the way I'm always trying to do the biographical things is to fictionalize them, essentially. Because I think, for me at least, that's a really important way to somehow like lose the specificity of what the project is about, you know? So, you know, for example, before Geomancer, and so about like three or 4 years ago, I did every project I made was like really site-specific, really going into the history of the place, really talking to people who were there, who lived through it, who live there now, and trying to like basically build this link between this idea of, you know, the virtual and the idea of the real, essentially, through narrative, essentially. And what I found was limiting with that is that the more site-specific something is, or the more time-specific something is, the more it remains a kind of like this kind of like artifact of its own time and place after, you know, a year afterwards. So for example, if you were to look at I don't know, a lineup from a music festival from 2016, it's like ancient history now, you know? So the way that time progresses, I personally felt, even though I'd only been doing it for a few years, was just so incredibly relentless. So in relation to the idea about time and obsolescence, you know, I talked about design obsolescence, hype obsolescence, or genre as well. And it's the same in every kind of creative industry, right? Not the simplest way to say it is like trends, fashions, cycles, and so on. But for me, myself, I felt that was important to, like, again, write that into the work so that I was no longer be so concerned about it because it already existed in this fictionalized world. And then the question then became not like what happens when I'm useless, but what happens when everyone's come to terms with that state, you know? Because of course, after like people stop being tied to the field or being tied to like servitude or being tied to a certain form of labor, they found something else to do, you know? And I think that idea of like finding something else to do, which is both existential if like you're an artist or creative, I think it's just a really interesting point. And of course with Geomancer, which takes this idea of, you know, like portrait of the artist or like artistic awakening or coming of age narrative, which of course as human beings we generally associate with like going to school, being a teenager. But I think it's really important to like revisit, at least for me, revisit those questions periodically. So that's kind of what, Geomancer and Idol are also about, right? So I can imagine in 10 years' time, there'll be like an Adobe button that's just auto-generating a film based on your life story, right? It's like, Steve, you know, like auto-generate a film about exciting music narrative or whatever, you know, and it's not that, like, I can see that happening, you know. It's just a confluence of a few different technologies for automating creativity happening. And of course, I can't deny the worth of that because, of course, I wouldn't have been able to make this film on basically a couple of computers if most of those tools and automation did not already exist for me. So I'm totally like within that web already, and I don't feel that searching for authenticity or originality is anything other than like a romantic ideal, even though by nature I'm, you know, pretty sentimental and emotional about stuff. But I don't think that's a place that's productive to dwell in creatively.
I mean, it's interesting because all this plays out literally in the narratives, in Geomancer and in Idol. And so in Idol you have this kind of neurotic pop star, diva, or, you know, a pop star who's had, used to be in a band called the Synths in the 2050s, apparently. And she's trying to she or the company that she's signed to, Farsight, are trying to rejuvenate her career. And the record company is quite blatant about what it takes to, you know, so there's a question of pop stars obsolescence that's going on there. But it's interesting the way the record company deal with her, you know, they're looking for the most generic thing possible. They're looking for something that's immediately attention grabbing. You know, all the cliches of pop music kind of crystallized and distilled and automated and so on. Except not automated because they're biosupremacists. But then the relationship between Diva and Geo is interesting because Geo and AI allows Diva to complete the song that she needs to perform at the Esports Olympics. So it's a tangled web of pop star obsolescence, needing AI to complete. There's a great line, let me just find this. There's a great exchange between Diva and Geo.
It sounds just like everything else.
Yeah, well, Geo is kind of saying that she, or it, came to Soma, came to the School of Machine Art, came to the underground caves of the Sound of Futures in order to learn how to create, not to predict the future. And then in a later conversation between Geo and Diva, so Geo's a bit insecure about what she can do to help Diva finish her music, and Diva's so Geo's worried about being generic, and Diva's like, well, that's perfect. I need you to help me plagiarize myself. You misunderstand genius. Machine learning killed the cult of originality. So just absorb everything I've done before and regenerate my music for me.
Right, I mean, there's, again, of course, I'll just talk specifically about music. This idea that, you know, you always have to reinvent the wheel or you have to do something different each time. And I kind of wanted to, play on this idea of not just like originality and variation, but also think about how it plays out from just a very economic point of view. So first of all, like my observation is this weird paradox that like death is good for sales, right? Death is great for sales because it gives like a finality to things. There's a time to have like retrospectives, all the friends and family kind of like give their condolences. Basically, the end of life brings hype, and hype brings sales, and sales bring a form of like immortality to an artist's work across all arts that they might not have had in their lifetime.
I mean, there's also a sense that, I don't know if I'm understanding this right, that Diva's potentially quite old and is only being kept alive by these immortality drugs provided by Farsight called life. So Diva's going, I need more life, and the record company is saying, well, finish the record and we'll give you more life.
Yeah.
So I don't know how old Diva is, but
no one knows.
She seems pretty desperate for more life.
Right, but then there's also, I mean, there's actually a couple of like pharmaceuticals that pervade the film. So one is life, this drug that is kind of longevity, and the other as well is, I mean, Soma, basically, School of Machine Art. So, I mean, what is that? In Brave New World, I think, Soma is the drug that people take to be okay with the state of the universe, basically. That it's not like that exciting, but it's basically like a placebo / antidepressant to continue through things. And of course, in the film, it's not about the drug as like an upper or a downer. It's actually the drug that just keeps you cruising through, in a sense. So anyway, in the film, life is there to signify this, like, how should I say, I think I mentioned before, this like Faustian pact that Diva has, or any creator of stuff has, between what they make, the life that they have to live in order to make that, and the sacrifice that they have to do. So in Diva's case, the sacrifice may be like anonymity in order to achieve immortality, basically, so that, you know, because she is essentially faceless, anyone can be her. And of course, there's conversations about, you know, Vocaloid stars like Hatsune Miku being the same thing, of like fans can be her, and like have this weird kind of ownership / empathetic relationship, which of course the star has with their fans, that is not so clear cut, I think, because of course the classic 20th century version of star and fan is very different from the 20th century version, which is more about influencer and audience, you know, because there's less barriers between a kind of individual and their creative work and their audience, especially, you know, live streaming things and platforms and so on.
Yeah, because you also have this, propose this question of superintelligence. That, you know, is it to be a musician? Is it to produce music without musicians, or architecture without architects, games without gamers, gambling without gamblers, and philosophy without philosophers, and influence without influencers?
Yeah,
as well.
So I think this. I mean, just to go briefly into the other side of what I was thinking about is not just like the culture of stardom and influencer, or essentially the culture of culture. And of course, you know, a big trend essentially is in arts, culture, and philosophy is about, you know, the idea of surveillance, right? The idea of surveillance, big data, people watching you all the time, creating a data profile of you based on shopping habits and anything that they come up online. But how it relates to music, personally, I think is fascinating, because I always think that music, because of its very nature as like sound, both, you know, like can be very easily commodified, but at the same time the experience of it also resists that commodification, because it is sound that does not have a physical presence when it's actually transmitted. It can have a physical embodiment when it's, you know, distributed, but the act of perception is something kind of beyond and really beyond an object. And I feel because of that, it's always like at the forefront of like new methods of distribution and intelligence. So now, for example, the intelligence that SoundCloud or YouTube or Spotify have of listeners is incredibly granular, right? Not just the relationship between different tracks or genres of music that you like based on your listening profile and age, but also when you very simply start and stop listening to a track. And because there's more information about your listening time, not your overall grand listening time, oh, you know, you listen to 5 albums and 300 songs like it used to be. It's more like you stopped at 12 seconds, 594 milliseconds. So therefore, from an algorithmic point of view, or a commercial point of view, it needs to somehow capture the attention so that you can listen to 34 seconds. And then after the 34 seconds barrier is up, maybe you might listen to the whole 3 minutes. So the whole durational thing totally changes.
Should we open it up to questions?
Well, I'm sorry to break you off at that point. I think we should probably pause now before the screening at 5:30, and I suggest that if people have particular questions for Steve or Lawrence, maybe grab them now before the screening, which will be at 4:30. But I'd just like to thank you both very much for that. That's amazing. Thank you.
Thanks.